stop sharing and turn it back to Lisa.
All right, thank you. So we are so excited to have Dr. Glenn Tsipursky join us. Dr. Gleb is an internationally renowned thought leader in future proofing. We can use it. He specializes in helping forward-looking leaders secure their organization's futures by forecasting and addressing threats and maximizing opportunities. He is the CEO of the future proofing consultancy, Disaster Avoidance Experts. A best-selling author of several traditionally published books, Dr. Gleb is most well known for his 2019 bestseller, Never Go With Your Gut: How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decision and Avoid Business Disasters, published by Career Press, and his 2020 best-selling book, The Blind Spots Between Us: How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships, published by New Harbinger. His groundbreaking thought leadership was featured in over 550 articles and 450 interviews in prominent venues. These include USA Today, Time, Fast Company, CBS News, Fortune, Inc. Magazine, CNBC, and many more. Dr. Gleb's expertise comes from over 20 years of consulting, coaching, and training. His clients include innovative startups, major nonprofits, and Fortune 500 companies ranging from Aflac to Xerox. His expertise also comes from his research background as a behavioral scientist with 15 years in academia, including 7 as a professor at The Ohio State University. In his free time, he makes sure to spend abundant quality time with his wife to avoid his personal life turning into a disaster. And so to help us take advantage of his groundbreaking expertise, the ASQ 0809 has asked him to share his presentation, Defeating Unconscious Bias via the Neuroscience of Emotional and Social Intelligence for Quality Professionals. And I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Dr. Gleb.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. All right, everyone. So let's talk about how you, as quality professionals and future quality professionals, for those of you who are students or other areas where you want to go with your MBA, how you can defeat unconscious bias. We'll talk about what unconscious bias is. But first of all, let's talk a little bit about our sense of selves and how do we think about the world. And the first thing I want to talk about is our sense of confidence. So I'll talk about the kind of sense and the kind of mistakes we tend to make. That's what unconscious bias is. That'll be the first part of the presentation. And then the second part will be about addressing it. And like I said, the first thing I want to talk about is how do we actually make sense of the world? How do we look at the world? We are told that we should be confident in business, right? Be confident, trust your intuition, trust your instincts. That is a very primal aspect of what business leaders are and future business leaders are taught to do. Being confident is important in making good business decisions. You don't want to run into analysis paralysis. And it's important in other areas of life. So for example, driving. So let's talk a little bit about driving, not directly related to business decisions, but related to also to the kind of decisions we make in our lives. And I want to ask you, do you consider yourself an above average driver? Are you personally an above average driver? So let's take a little poll about this and see how good are your driving skills. Would you say you're in the top half of all drivers or the bottom half of all drivers? You should see the poll right now and you should be able to click on it. So click, indicate whether you're in the bottom half of all drivers or in the top half of all drivers. See, we have about 80% of the people voting. Great, let's get a couple more. Make sure to make your voice heard. I'll give you 5 more seconds. All right. So interestingly enough, we have 76% of the people here are in the top half of all drivers. And 24% of the people here are in the bottom half of all drivers. Math doesn't quite add up, does it? That's a pretty typical result that I get when asking these questions. It's actually based on a study that was done a while ago. I think it was 1978 or something like that, actually on college students who were asked whether they're in the top half of all drivers, the bottom half of all drivers. And what the study found was that 93% of college students said that they're in the top half of all drivers, because people tend to be overconfident. And that is something that we really need to understand when we address bias within ourselves. We tend to be overconfident about our lives, ourselves, the way that we think. And again, some people, I'm sure, put you're in the bottom half. 24% of you put that you're in the bottom half of all drivers. But overall, all of us tend to be too confident in our decisions. So we have a lot of research showing that confidence bias, overconfidence bias, is a major problem in our lives and how we think and make decisions in business and other life areas. This is the term that you want to remember, overconfidence bias, and it of course refers to our tendency to be way too confident, all sorts of decisions. When people say they're 100% confident, that is when you said you're 100% confident, you'd bet the house, you'd bet your company on this decision. What we find, researchers find, is that they're actually only 80% right. No wonder Las Vegas makes so much money, right? You tend to be very confident that it's red, you put everything on it, turns out to be green, and vice versa. And we make risky decisions all the time because we feel too confident in them. And we feel too confident about ourselves, and we don't pause to think, okay, might I be biased here when I'm thinking about these people? Might there be this unconscious bias within me that's causing me to make bad decisions around the way I relate to people? And of course, unconscious bias refers to how we make mistakes when we evaluate others unconsciously, without being aware of it, just in the same way that we are too confident about our driving or our business decisions or our academic decisions, all sorts of things. And by the way, this goes for professors too. There was a study done on Stanford professors, and they were asked, are you in the top half of all professors by skill in being a professor, or bottom half? More than 90% of professors said that they're in the top half of all professors, FYI. Especially dangerous for those with more experience and authority. So the more experience and authority you tend to get, the more confident you feel and the more overconfident you feel in your decisions. And you don't notice how the environment might change in such a way to make your experience less relevant. For example, obviously the pandemic is a situation where the environment seriously changed and people should be much less confident in the quality of their decision-making, but they still tend to be way too confident for their own good. So that's the overconfidence bias that I want to be thinking about. And that relates, oh, I think somebody accidentally unmuted themselves, so please don't do that. That relates to how we're taught to make decisions in business settings and life settings, but we're focusing here on business settings and our professional settings. We're taught to go with our gut, follow our intuitions, trust our heart. That's what gurus tell us. People like Tony Robbins, who tells you to be primal, be savage. That's his shtick. Or Malcolm Gladwell, who tells you to blink, make your decision in the blink of an eye. It feels good to go with your gut, to trust your intuition, to follow your heart. But as we already see, when people follow their heart, they tend to be way too confident. It feels very comfortable to trust our gut, to follow our intuition, but that often leads to disastrous decisions. In people relationships, in our business settings, that's what unconscious bias is, and in all other sorts of decisions, whether you're making decisions around quality for ASQ, or all sorts of other decisions for those of you who are in the MBA program and will go on to other areas of professional work. Because our gut, our intuition, our emotions, they're actually not evolved for the modern world. That is the big problem with them. They're evolved for the ancient savannah, when we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people. That's what they're evolved for. We were hunters, gatherers, and foragers. So what's a critical aspect of that dynamic? Well, we had to be very tribal in that savannah environment in order to survive. We had to like people who looked like us, who thought like us, who cared about the same things that we do. And we had to be, because otherwise, if we weren't tribal enough, we'd be kicked out of our tribe and we'd die. And we had to oppose hostile tribes that were trying to take over our territory. So people who didn't look like us, who didn't have our values, who didn't have our appearance. And therefore, we still have that intuition. That's what unconscious bias is, this intuition, the sense of our bias. The overconfidence is one dynamic that's going on. Tribalism is another dynamic that's going on that you have to really be aware of. We tend to be overconfident in our decisions around people, and we tend to be tribal in how we relate to people when we just go with our gut, when we follow our intuition and we trust our heart. So that's a big, big problem for our decision making, unfortunately. And it causes us to run into all sorts of situations. And so I want to ask you right now in another poll, have you ever felt truly confident you were right on a significant decision, but then turned out to be wrong? Was that an experience that you ever had? Whether it's a professional decision or a life decision, that you felt really confident that you were right. And I know it happened to me in professional settings. So for example, I remember promoting someone who in my team who into an assistant manager role. And I thought she'd be great at it, but she turned out to be really bad. She was micromanaging people. She didn't really relate to them well. She couldn't make the transition effectively. So I was pretty wrong in that, and I felt confident I'd be right. Give you 5 more seconds to vote if you didn't yet. All right. So we see that for over 90% of you, this is an experience you had. And so given that this is an experience you had, you can have that experience, and that's a way that you can tell that your gut intuition is far from always correct, that you feel confident in something, your gut tells you to go with it, but you, on a significant decision, made the wrong choice. And you want to avoid trusting your gut on significant decisions, especially around people, because of that tribalism. You want to have other, more effective approaches instead, and we'll talk about those. This is all the results of dangerous judgment errors, which are specific mistakes in how our brain is wired. They're called cognitive biases, if you've heard of this term. Cognitive biases is the academic term for these dangerous judgment errors, the scholarly term. So if you look it up on Wikipedia, you'll see a list of over 100 cognitive biases, and overconfidence bias will be one of them. There's a lot of them. They're basically the way that our brain goes wrong because of our evolutionary background, the way that we evolved. We didn't evolve for the modern environment, and we feel one way, but the modern environment is very different. It's not a good idea to be tribal in the modern environment. It doesn't contribute to our survival to be tribal. In the savanna environment, we're the descendants of those who are very tribal, very tribally oriented. The most tribally oriented people were the ones who survived, thrived, and reproduced, and we're their descendants. If our ancestors weren't sufficiently tribal, they'd die, and we wouldn't be born. So we are very much tribal, and there are other dynamics that come from the evolutionary background, like overconfidence, as well as the structure of our brain, just how our brain is wired and how it processes information. I won't go into the neuroscience of this too much. If you have questions, we can ask questions in the Q&A. Now, I want to get at a question that probably a number of you have been thinking about as you heard me speak. Where are you from? Where are you from is a common question I get. When you saw me, you probably saw someone who just looked normative, male, white. No, you're not going to think that, hey, this person is from somewhere different. But when you hear me speaking, I obviously have an accent, right? So it's clear. And this is an accent from a small country called Moldova in Eastern Europe. That's where my parents had me, and they left Moldova in 1991 when I was 10 and settled in New York City. So that's kind of home for me. New York City is home for me. And when we settled in New York City, I was very glad to make this move, but I was especially glad in 1996 when there was a World Values Survey, which found that Moldova, among the countries surveyed, was the least happy country in the world. The least happy country in the world. I don't know why. I was 10 when I left, but that made me especially glad that they left. So I settled in New York City, and it was a cultural melting pot, very diverse. You hear lots of accents around, like my accent. So I chose not to drop my accent. I know many people chose to drop their accents, especially those who didn't go to a cultural melting pot like New York City, who didn't hear diverse accents around them. And a number of people, like myself, chose to keep their accent. Unfortunately, as I found out later, that was kind of a dumb decision because of a phenomenon called accent discrimination. So when you look at the research on how people feel about accents, how people in the United States feel about accents, people with accents that are foreign have a false perception of being less trustworthy. So those with foreign accents are seen as less trustworthy by Americans. There's only one accent to which this really doesn't apply, and that's the British accent. They still have that cultural imperialism going for them. So I wish I had I wish I had dropped my accent, but I was already too old by the time I found this out in graduate school when I was on the way to being a professor. Now, this accent discrimination relates to two more cognitive biases. It's not a cognitive bias itself. It's a consequence of a cognitive bias that very much have to do with tribalism, called the halo effect and the horns effect. The halo effect and the horns effect. The horns effect relates to the fact that if you dislike one characteristic of someone, you will tend to have too negative view of all of their other characteristics. So again, if they have a foreign accent, you'll tend to have too negative view of their of everything else. If there's something that shows you that they're not part of your tribe in their appearance, in their sexuality, in their religion, in their politics, in their value sets, you will intuitively have too negative view of their other characteristics. You will distrust them. You will not want to hire them. You will not want to work with them. And that, of course, is a primary aspect of unconscious bias. The other aspect of unconscious bias that is also fundamentally important is the halo effect. If you like one characteristic, if it tells you that this person is part of your tribe, if you went to the same college, or if you find that out, if you root for the same sports team, again, culture, religion, politics, values, you'll have too positive view of their other characteristics. And of course, this is especially bad for business relationships of various sorts. I'll give you an interesting example. I was giving a presentation to a closing keynote to a group of HR professionals on diversity and inclusion. So this was a diversity and inclusion conference in Columbus, Ohio. And this is my hometown. This is where I live now. I lived here for the last 10 years, Ohio State University, as Lisa mentioned. So what I did in this conference, which was 2 years ago, still back when we can do this in person. And maybe, in a year we can do it in person again, we'll see. But this was still in person, 2018. And if you know something about Columbus, Ohio, you'll probably know that it's famous as the hometown of the Ohio State Buckeyes, our football team. It's a huge football team, lots and lots of football fans here. When I was a professor at Ohio State, I was contractually obligated to root for the Buckeyes. So that was a part of being the phenomenon of being a professor there. And if you know anything about college football, you'll know that our big rival is the University of Michigan Wolverines, the big rival of the Buckeyes, one of the biggest rivalries in college football, if not the biggest. And so I asked those people at this Central Ohio conference, where people are pretty much from the local area, over 100 leaders, HR leaders, on a conference of diversity and inclusion, so the diversity and inclusion experts, closing keynote, I asked them, how many of you would hire a University of Michigan fan? How many of you would hire a Wolverines fan? And you know what? Over 100 people there, only 3 people raised their hands. 3 people. It's true. I have it on video, so I was able to record it because, that was back then when we could have in-person things. And so that's an example of how the horns effect really causes damage in organizations, in business relationships. Obviously, which team you root for has no relevance for your ability to perform in a workplace, but it really impacts whether HR leaders and who are diversity inclusion experts would hire you. And of course, the halo effect does that as well. If they'll be more likely to hire Buckeye fans, unfortunately. And that's how it works. So now, take a look at the poll. We'll have another poll. I want to ask about the halo effect. Did you ever observe the halo effect or the horns effect having a negative impact on your workplace? Or for students, you can ask a negative impact in your academia. So please vote. Great, I see 80% of the people voted. I'll give you 5 more seconds to vote. All right. So we see that this is something that the large majority of you experienced. Over 86% of you've observed the halo effect or the horns effect having a negative impact in the workplace or in academia. And so that's something to be really aware of and watch out for. All right. So let's talk a little bit about another cognitive bias another pair of cognitive biases that I think you should really be aware of. The optimism bias and the pessimism bias. The optimism bias and the pessimism bias. Optimism bias, it refers to people who are very optimistic, and that's me. I am very optimistic, I'm very forward-looking, I'm opportunity-oriented, I'm entrepreneurial, I'm very creative, but I tend to be too risk-blind. I tend to take too many risks and make too many mistakes. So I'm too positive about the future, and that causes me to look only at rewards, overwhelmingly at rewards, not enough at risks, not enough at problems. That's the optimism bias. And the pessimism bias is the opposite. It's someone who really focuses on managing threats, someone who's a stabilizer, someone who's an improver, but tends to be too risk averse. So tends to see too many risks, not enough opportunities. So people in the quality sector would tend to be more pessimistically inclined. And that's different for me. I tend to be more optimistically inclined. So that's a difference that you'll see often in organizations where there are some people who have more of the control functions like quality or risk management or the financial functions, CFO and so on, and everyone in that department being more pessimistic, and other people who are more in operations, people in operations would be more optimistic, especially people in sales and marketing would be more optimistic. And what the research showed on optimism and pessimism bias is you really need people on your team, at least two of both types, whether you're in quality, if you have a diverse team from different aspects of the department, you can have people who are in quality and risk management as part of a project team, and other people, of course, as part of a project team, and people who are creative as well as part of and entrepreneurial who are part of the project team. You need people who are diverse in order to make good decisions. If you have too many people who are optimistic, you will just have people generating ideas and not really implementing them effectively and not checking for the flaws of these ideas. I'm the type of person who has 20 ideas before breakfast, and it feels like they're all brilliant. That's what my gut reaction feels, that they're all brilliant. Now, imagine if I only had people on my team. So I run a company, disaster avoidance experts. That's a training, consulting, coaching company. Imagine if I only hired people who are optimistic. It's very tempting for me to hire people who are only optimistic. I click with them very well. I like them, they like me, and we can collaborate well together. We bounce ideas off each other. It feels great. But then if I only hired people like that, we'd all be reinforcing each other's ideas and we'd be running in 120 different directions. So that's not great for a 6-people team. I make sure to hire some people into the company and have people on the teams who are pessimistic, who are not inclined to generate ideas. But what I do is I give my 20 brilliant ideas to them, and then they are great at saying, these are all half-baked potatoes, but these 3 are worth finishing baking. And then they take those 3 ideas and they evaluate what are the flaws and the problems, and then they fix them, they improve them. They're great at addressing threats, improving things, and then implementing them effectively. That's their strength. So you need both on the team. And you need to know how to collaborate effectively, because what tends to happen with people who are pessimistic is that they tend to be branded as the Mr. No or the Mrs. No of the company. And people in quality roles often have this problem. They tend to be branded as the Mr. No, Mrs. No, and people who are optimistic of the quality professionals tend to see them as having too many half-baked ideas and not keeping their feet on the ground. And there's a lot of conflict that happens. That's not a great way to collaborate. What you really need to do in order to collaborate effectively is to separate the process of brainstorming, generating ideas, give that to the people who are more optimistic, and not force people who are pessimistic to do brainstorming. It really doesn't work very well for them. It's a lot of emotional labor. It's hard. What they should do is that optimistic people should hand over their ideas after brainstorming to the people who are more pessimistic. Give up ownership and have the people who are more pessimistic evaluate the ideas, improve them, and choose the few remaining ones, and then implement them effectively. That's what works much better. And so this is an example of unconscious bias in action, which harms companies a lot when they don't know how to collaborate effectively, how to collaborate well between people who are optimistic and pessimistic. All right, next poll. Did you ever observe the optimism bias or the pessimism bias having a negative impact on your workplace or in your academic place, if in academia, if you are still a student and haven't had a chance to do work? So please go ahead and vote. I see 75% of the people voted. Let's give people 5 more seconds. Great. And we see again that a large majority of you, 89% of you, saw this impact on your workplace or in your academic life. So this is something that's definitely prevalent and powerful. Let's talk a little bit about how to address these dangerous judgment errors, which cause these bad ideas and decisions about our relationships with other people, as well as other areas of life. You need to go against your intuitions. You need to not trust your gut, however uncomfortable that may be, because our gut, our intuitions evolved to help early humans survive. It was great for that sort of environment, which was very intense, very in the moment, very threat-oriented. But that threat orientation is not really a good fit for making decisions in today's world. So consider donuts, right? Something that's very tasty, very pleasant. You walk into a break room or in your college office somewhere after an event, and there's a box full of donuts. Someone left them there for everyone to share. So what happens? It's very tempting to take a donut. So you decide, well, okay, I'll just take half a donut. So you take half a donut, and then you're like, well, I really don't want to leave half a donut there for other people, right? So you take the other half of the donut. And then you're kind of triggered by the sugar. So you're like, okay, you take another donut and then another donut. And then before you know it, half the box is gone. Not that it ever happened to me, right? Now, why does that happen? It seems very weird that our brain, our gut reactions, our intuitions would be comfortable with taking that many donuts. It doesn't seem like it's the right thing to do in the modern world. And honestly, after the first donut, can you really taste so fully the rest of the donuts? No, you can't, because that's not how our brain works. Our brain is wired for the savanna environment. And in that environment, it was very important when we're triggered by sugar to eat as much of the sugar as possible. Honey, bananas, apples, eat as much of it as possible. And so right now in the modern world, we're triggered by sugar. And of course, with a processed food, the companies know what triggers us the most, and they process the food in such a way as that we're most triggered. And that's where donuts come from, our current version of donuts. That's a big problem in today's world. And you've probably already learned some techniques to address that. Maybe you skip those donuts and go for the healthy bowl of fruit that's also there. And so you decide, okay, I'm skipping the donuts, I'm going for the fruit. And that's one way out of many that you can address the unhealthy eating habits that are very intuitive, very comfortable to our gut in the modern world. There's a reason we have the obesity epidemic here in the United States. So you've all come up with some ways to address your intuition to not eat very healthy, whether by going for fruit or some other way, and dealing with this triggering by sugar. In the same way, this is something you do for your sake of your physical fitness. In the same way, for the sake of your mental fitness, in order to make the right decisions, in order to not have unconscious bias toward other people and have bad business relationships because you like the wrong people or you dislike the wrong people, then you need to address your mental fitness as well and overcome these dangerous judgment errors. Go against your intuitions, not trust your gut in people relationships. Now, what you need here is to learn the skills of both emotional intelligence and social intelligence. Emotional intelligence and social intelligence alike. Emotional intelligence, what's that? Probably might have heard this term. It has to do with your awareness of your own emotions, your own awareness and your own ability to manage your own emotions. That's what it's about. Awareness and management of your emotions. That's how you can tell, okay, my gut reaction is causing me to have some kind of response toward this person. But just because the gut reaction is having this response, whether it's a horns effect, whether it's a halo effect, or whether you're too confident about your reactions toward this person, or whether it's one of the many over 100 other cognitive biases, you should not trust your gut and you should make better decisions. That's what emotional intelligence is about. Awareness and management of your emotions. Social intelligence is about other people, about influencing other people, your awareness and your ability to manage to influence other people's emotions and their relationships to you and to each other. And social intelligence is what leaders need especially. Now, everyone needs emotional intelligence, right? Everyone to be a successful professional needs emotional intelligence. In order to be a successful leader, in order to be successfully, and you don't need to simply lead other people. You can be a leader on a project, so coordinating a project team, anything that you want to do. You need to have social intelligence, being able to be aware of and manage other people's emotions and relationships. And that includes telling when they're falling into unconscious bias and other sorts of problems, these dangerous judgment errors, these cognitive biases, and being able to address it. So those are the skills that you need to build up. And there are a couple of ways of building them up. One is to have awareness. And this awareness of these dangerous judgment errors you can get from the assessment on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace, which takes a look at the 30 most dangerous judgment errors in professional settings and helps you evaluate their extent and impact in your workplace, in your career, or in academia if you're still a student, and provides you with the next steps for addressing them. So I'm going to share my screen, and you'll see the assessment. And I want you to pull up the chat function, because we'll be using the chat for this part of the presentation. So the directions. First, the directions. Each question below in the assessment refers to a specific problem that might occur in a professional situation. And your goal is to indicate how often the problem occurred in your workplace. How often it occurred in your workplace in terms of percentages over the last year. So you can do this assessment for yourself as an individual, for your organization as a whole, for a specific department, or for a specific team. Don't overthinking, just go with your initial impression. Each question should take you 10 to 15, 20 seconds at most. So, like I said, we'll be using the chat function to get answers to the assessment. And the first one will be number 6. So, number 6 will be the first one. When a potential or current employee was evaluated, in what percentage of situations was the evaluation too positive due to factors not relevant to their job competency, organizational fit? If you're still a student, you can talk about when, let's say, professors evaluated other students. What percentage of the situations was the evaluation too positive? Okay, we have 95%, 50%, 50%, 70%, 45%, 75%, 50, 60. So we see quite a variety here, quite high. So this tells me that the halo effect, this is about the halo effect, of course, where we tend to judge other people too positively, not directly related to factors that we should use to evaluate them. And we make mistakes as a result of that. Now, when your company is in the 10 to 20% range or others, that's not a big deal. When you're getting into the 20 to 30% range, that's more of a problem. When you're 30% and higher, that's definitely a problem because you're making bad decisions around people systematically. And so that's a serious issue. All right. Now, another one is going to be number 5. Think about of all the situations when an individual or team had to deal with difficult or uncomfortable issues, especially around team dynamics, people relationships, but focused on trivial issues instead. For example, when someone is doing an evaluation for a promotion, for all sorts of things, where they focused on the small issues that don't really matter that much instead of the really larger issues that matter. Or a team that's talking about a project that focuses way too much attention on the small issues that don't matter too much and not nearly enough on the serious issues that do. So we have 45%, 20%, 80%, 50%, 97%, 40%, 18%, oh, that's specific, 35%, 80%, 75%, 85%. So quite prevalent. And again, this is something that's in the 10 to 20%, not a big deal when it's getting to 20 to 30, it becomes more serious. It's above 30, it becomes definitely serious because you're not dealing with actual problem. You're not dealing with the actual issue. And that is an aspect of course, bias, where we are, because of our disinclination to deal with people issues, with relationships, with people troubles, we focus attention away from them, from the serious issues at hand, toward much more trivial issues, which are much more comfortable for our gut reaction to deal with. This is actually called bike shedding. So this cognitive bias is called bike shedding. And why it's called that? Well, because it's called that based on a case study where when a number of construction project managers were tasked with designing a nuclear plant, they spent way too much time compared to how much they should have designing a bike shed next to the nuclear plant instead of the actual nuclear plant. So that's called bike shedding. And there are going to be 28 other questions like this. So you can see some of them over here. So that's what the assessment is about. And I'll send it to you, those of you who want it. Now, but before we do that, let's take a look at the poll. Do you think it would be valuable for you and your team, if you're part of a team, to take the assessment and address the dangerous judgment errors it uncovers? Do you think that would be valuable for you and or your team, if you're part of one? Great, so I see 2/3 of you voted. Let's give folks 5 more seconds to make their voice heard. Great, okay, so 100%, 100%, everyone will find value. Great, I'll give you an opportunity to get it after the presentation. Excellent, and then, so this is the first step of addressing cognitive biases, being aware of them, of course. The next step is to take decisions, use strategic decision-making techniques, which would help you address these cognitive biases. And specifically, I want to talk about a quick technique that you can use for all sorts of decisions that you don't want to screw up. This is not meant to get you the perfect decision. There's much longer and more thorough techniques which are meant to get you the perfect decision on something really serious. This is something you can use 5 to 10 times a day when you're writing an email to a colleague or to a professor, or when you're making a certain decision about who to invite to a meeting, who to collaborate with on a project, for example. This is something that you want to do to avoid disasters. You want a good enough response, you want a good enough answer. This is for good enough decisions so that you don't screw things up. 5 questions to avoid these decision disasters. First, what information haven't I yet fully considered? So what evidence didn't you fully take into account? We're very tempted to look for information that confirms our beliefs and ignore information that doesn't. That's called confirmation bias. So you want to look twice as hard for information that goes against your intuitions, goes against your beliefs. That's the first part of it. Second, you want to think about what information is important. You don't want to look for all the information. You want to look only for important information. If you look for too much information, you'll get stuck in analysis paralysis. So for different levels of decision, depending on how important the decision, you want to look for more or less information. What dangerous judgment errors didn't I yet fully address? If you're dealing with a person, the halo effect or the horns effect, and many other issues, as you take the assessment and you learn about these dangerous judgment errors, which are talked about in the assessment, you will be able to recognize and respond to this question pretty quickly. What would a trusted and objective advisor suggest I do? So think about that little angel on your shoulder. What would they suggest you do in this situation, whatever the decision might be? By taking yourself outside of yourself, you get about 50% of the benefit of this question, research shows. And of course, you can get the other 50% of the benefit by calling this person, or if you're a college student, millennial, texting this person, or Gen Z. Next, how have I addressed all the ways this could fail? So how have you addressed all the ways this decision can fail? Again, for more important decisions, you want to spend more time on this. For less important decisions, don't spend as much time on this. This whole technique for lesser important decisions, it should take you 2 minutes or so if the decision is correct, and once you learn how to use it. And of course, if it's not correct, you want to take more time. So how have you addressed all the ways this decision can fail? And finally, what new information can you get that would cause you to revisit this decision? What would cause you to change your mind about this decision? Once we make a decision, it's very hard for us to change our minds. We tend to get stuck to it. It's called post-factum rationalization. So we rationalize our decision after the fact, and we tend to get stuck with it. But if we decide in advance that, hey, here's some new information that would cause us to revisit this decision, that causes us to be unstuck and much more likely to update our beliefs as information changes, as the situation changes. This is a great technique for you to use by yourself, but also a great technique for you to use as part of a team. Everyone in a company can, or in a class, can use this to make their decisions. Their decisions would be much, much, much better about all sorts of things. And that's one way that you can use it. Then you can know and be much more confident in the decision-making techniques of your colleagues, what decisions are, how are they approaching decisions. And if something doesn't go well, you can talk to them about, hey, show me your 5 questions run through and what questions you answered. Or if you're talking about a decision, you can talk about your mutual answers to these 5 questions. It's especially helpful for a team decision-making meeting. So if you're part of a team and you want to make a decision, what you do is have everyone on the team, 6 people or so, answer these questions in advance of the meeting for themselves, and then structure the agenda along the whole 5 questions. And then you just go through it one point by one point. Everyone shares their answer, starts by sharing their answer. You discuss the answer to number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. And you get to the decision much, much quicker. It takes, usually on average, it cuts down about 60% of the time for decision-making meetings, because otherwise you get stuck in various loops, corners, you forget certain things, you go back to the beginning. But this is such a quick method for making decisions. It really helps you make sure that you make good decisions. Let's take a look at a poll on this one. Oh, I should stop sharing the results. So the 5 questions technique. Do you think it would be valuable for you and your team, again, if you're part of a team, to use the 5 questions technique to avoid bad decisions, to get good enough answers? So please go ahead and vote. See, about 2/3 of the people voted. I'll give the rest of you about 5 more seconds to vote, make your voice heard. Okay, excellent. So we see again 100% uptake. So great, and I'll send you a decision aid on these for those folks who want a decision aid on the 5 questions. All right, and then finally, so I talked about getting the resources for free additional resources. You'll get the assessment on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace, the decision aid on 5 key questions to avoid decision disasters, and a digital copy of my best-selling book that Lisa mentioned, The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships. So this is, again, poll. So please vote on whether you would like the free post-training resources. Please go ahead and vote. And while folks are voting, I'll be happy to take questions. So happy to take questions. Please go ahead, share whatever you want to share. And yeah, go ahead.
I don't know, let's see who, I don't know, I don't want to step on anybody else if they have a question, but first of all, I would like to congratulate you. It's a very, very good presentation.
Oh, thank
so
you.
Much information.
Excellent.
Question for you. Because, you know, you talked about the optimism bias and the pessimism bias. And I know the, you know, folks in ASQ and quality people, you know, when you said about the pessimistic with this being more risk averse than
Yep.
than your type of folks, you know, is there any, are you aware, has there been any gender association with
Yes.
like women or more, and what is that?
Women tend to be more likely to be pessimistic than men. So if you have the optimism versus pessimism divide, and we're not exactly sure why it is, but it might have to do with testosterone and that men tend to be more aggressive in general, which correlates with taking actions, and that's correlated with optimism. Whereas women, by contrast, are less aggressive, less likely to take actions, and that correlates with pessimism. We're not sure if that's the explanation, but that might be one.
Okay, all right. And just along those lines, and then I'll let someone else ask a question, is there like, would you recommend like some sort of, I don't want to say like a litmus test, but like, for example, I think of teams, and I love the idea of how you said, you know, that the optimistic people do all the brainstorming and then give
Yep.
it to the pessimistic people.
Yep.
And because, you know, I'm guilty of putting my students, and they're all like, yeah, you are guilty, of putting them in a group and saying, okay, now brainstorm. This is how you brainstorm and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, you have you're going to have those types of biases in there. Is there like a litmus test, or how would I, as an instructor or as a person that's on a work team or something, say, well, these people are more pessimistic in terms of their bias as opposed to optimistic? What would you recommend there, Gleb?
What I would recommend is asking people whether they like to create ideas or improve ideas. And that's because you want something that's positively framed. And that's a question, some people are improvers and they know themselves to be improvers. They like to improve things. Some people are creators. I don't really like to do improving of ideas. I like to generate ideas and then more and more and more ideas. And so that depends on the person. That tells you whether they're optimistic or pessimistic. Now, if you want to think brainstorming, if you want to specifically talk about that, the way the research shows the best technique for brainstorming is, again, not having the pessimistic people do it, just having the optimistic and those people who are more in the middle do it. But the way to do it is to first get them to brainstorm by themselves on their own before coming to the team meeting. Because when you are in a team meeting, there are certain dynamics that come to the fore that shut down some people's ability to generate ideas. So the best ideas, the best brainstorming happens when people think about their ideas and come up with a list of something like 5 ideas, at least 5 ideas before the meeting, and they can come up with more, of course. And then they bring that to the meeting, they share their list with everyone, and then you use that to spring off new ideas. And so that's the best method of brainstorming. So you get those ideas in the room, and then you have a whole bunch of ideas which you hand over to people who are pessimistic, they evaluate them, and then they improve them.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else have some questions?
Yeah, I do. So in that regard, you're kind of using your optimistic people as your brainstorm without limitations.
Yep.
And then you're pulling in your pessimistic people, like if I have a project improvement team, to basically help rationalize what is feasible and what is kind of like, okay, that's a little in the clouds.
Yep, exactly.
And it's separate it.
You're exactly right, Justin. And it's very important to separate it, and for people who are optimistic to give up ownership. So you're completely giving up ownership. These are not your ideas anymore. You are giving them up. And so that you don't feel attached to them and you don't fight for them, which is what happens naturally in brainstorming meetings, that people fight for their idea. Not a good idea. That does not work well for actually coming up with the best ideas and projects. So giving up the ideas and the project improvement team from the brainstorming team.
Hi, I just have a follow-up question to that. This is Savitri Demon from Canada. So would you say it's a good blend to have 50-50? What if you end up with more pessimistic people than more optimistic people?
What the research shows is that you really want to have at least 2 on the team of each one. And then I would say if you can have a choice, then it would depend on whether you want a project that's more out of the box or you want a project that's more perfect. So you have more people if you have more optimistic people if you want kind of a more innovative, creative project, and you have more pessimistic people if you want a project that's more perfect. So that's what I would suggest.
I actually have more of it's just a comment. What you said about 5 key questions, that kind of resonated with me pretty well, because I've come across a lot of intergroup bias, especially with cross-functional teams. And I think approaching those questions beforehand definitely could help with some of those issues. So
excellent. Delighted to hear that.
Anybody else have any questions? Well, if anybody is thinking of any more, Dr. Gleb had shared with me some other resources that paper that he had done from the work from home. So, especially ASQ professionals that are on, you please visit the ASQ 0809 website, and there are links there that you can download his latest white paper about these work from home issues. I don't know, Dr. Gleb, if you wanted to mention anything about that or not.
Sure. So it's about how to deal with work from home burnout and Zoom fatigue, which some of you might be experiencing right now. So work from home and Zoom fatigue, the way that we typically deal with these, how companies deal with this, is that due to this very rapid switch in March, companies just adopted their office culture to virtual culture. And when you look at the research, it just does not work very well because you're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. So you're really making some mistakes in how you do things. For example, Zoom happy hours. Zoom happy hours are not very effective at all. Why are they not effective? For the same reason we suffer Zoom fatigue. When we look at each other on small squares on the screen, we don't get that human-to-human connection, that the tribalism. So going back to tribalism, for the tribalism aspect of us, which is very important, these are emotions, our intuitions. That's why we don't have burnout. When we work in the office, we feel connected to other people. We feel that they're part of our tribe. And so we feel energized by them. Now, in Zoom, we don't get that. We don't get that sense of connect, or it's much weaker, much less. And then our emotions, our intuitions still expect that. They expect to feel connected. And so there's a huge gap between expectations and reality. And so we end up feeling disappointed, drained, burned out. We don't get the energy that we used to get from interacting with people. And so that's just one out of many aspects of the paper that talks about the 14 problems that cause burnout and Zoom fatigue and the 21 solutions to these problems.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think we might be tapped out here, Dr.
All right.
I do have a question.
Oh, here we go.
Yes, Brooke, please go ahead.
I'm a business administration marketing major at SUNY Fredonia, and I was wondering, in the beginning of the presentation, I was writing a bunch of notes because I am attempting to write a presentation about branding connections to how people have things and trends inside their mind if they see certain different colors, if they would think if they saw like red, they'd think negatively of a company or something like. Could you possibly elaborate on potential patterns you see in branding with connections of potential cognitive biases or anything like that?
Of course, yeah. So you tend to have a lot of halo and horns effects, which people don't know, recognize are going on, how you relate to a number of people. You tend to have a lot of overconfidence in branding where the branding company tends to be too confident about its advertising working well. And we know, looking at the research on advertising, that Facebook ads, TV ads, Google search, SEO are not nearly as effective as they're made out to be by the companies that provide branding services. They tend to be overconfident about the quality of these. Another issue is narrative fallacy, cognitive bias. Our brains tend to absorb information very much in the form of stories. So when we're told a story, we tend to absorb that information quickly and without suspicion, without skepticism. And as a result, stories are very appealing to us. And of course, companies know that, branding companies know that, but that's one of the interesting things about how we relate to others, these narrative fallacies and how we think about stories. And one of the challenges so going back to the working from home, is that we are losing some of the stories of ourselves that we told ourselves in the workplace because of how we connect to other people. And we don't realize that our work identity is suffering somewhat because of this. And we're kind of lacking some of the meaning and purpose that we used to have, the fulfillment. So that's an example of the narrative fallacy functioning in other areas, not simply relating to branding and marketing. But thank you for the question, Brooke.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody else have anything to add? Questions?
Hi, I had a question.
Yes, Lynn, please go ahead.
So once we have this awareness of this bias, I guess what's really that next step when you realize, wow, my team has this, and so it's great with the brainstorming, but in terms of like perception of how your employer has of you or how maybe a team is doing. So really, what's that next step?
So each of the second half of the assessment has a description of each of the cognitive biases, the problems, and what you can do to address them. So I talked about optimism and pessimism bias. If you find that your team significantly suffers from these, and you need to decide based on the assessment, which of the problems that are outlined there is the biggest one for your team, biggest couple that you can work on. So if you decide, let's say it's the optimism and the pessimism bias, we already talked about how to address this. And there are ways of addressing each of the cognitive biases in similar ways. The book will also, that you'll get, will also go into that in much more depth. So the specific ways that you address each of the cognitive biases. So you discover which ones are most problematic, and then you take specific steps to address them. That's one dynamic. The second is you employ decision-making techniques that address a number of cognitive biases at once, like the 5 questions to avoid decision disasters. So that will help you also address a number of cognitive biases at once.
Perfect. That helps tie everything together, right? Because we heard all the different types and then that decision making. And so thank you for that clarification.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the question.
Anybody else? Anybody else? Okay, I think that we're going to let you go, Dr. Gleb. I'd like to give you a round of applause, and I know students have microphones, but I think everybody, and I know the ASQ members, certainly this was a valuable presentation, and it certainly exceeded like my expectations in terms, I have all these ideas, and I'm a pessimistic person, so I'm not the person that has, I'm not an idea person, but now I have them.
Excellent.
I appreciate that, and so I would just say on behalf of Fredonia State, as well as on behalf of the American Society for Quality, not only Erie, but the other sections that joined us, I would like to thank you. We wish you the very best, and thank you so much for your terrific presentation this evening.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate that, Lisa. And thank you all for coming and for asking the questions that you did for those who did. Excellent. All right.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.